One of the great joys of working at Hillsdale College is to have so many wonderful and dedicated colleagues. And one of those, dear friend of mine, is Dr. Ronald Pestritto. He holds the Charles and Lucia Sipley Chair in American Constitution. He's the graduate dean of the Van Andel Graduate School of Statesmanship, a still rather new addition to Hillsdale College, which is thriving at the campus. And at Hillsdale, he teaches political philosophy, American political thought, and American politics. It's no exaggeration to say he is one of the nation's leading experts on American progressivism and the progressive movement, and writes widely on progressivism and the administrative state for the public prints. And he is here today to chair our discussion on the future of marriage. Dr. Pestritto.
Thank you, and thanks to Matt for asking me to participate in this, what should prove to be a very interesting panel. I should add to the description that Matt gave of me, the most important thing this year is I'm the proud parent of a new Hillsdale College freshman, so that I think trumps the other things here. We have three distinguished panelists who are going to talk about the future of marriage in America: Ryan Anderson, David French, and Kay Hymowitz. I will introduce them at greater length before each of them speaks so that their credentials can be fresher in your minds as you listen to each of them. We're going to give them about 15 minutes each, and then we will perhaps have some intra-panel discussion before throwing it open to the audience and then proceeding to lunch. And we're going to begin with Ryan Anderson. So Ryan Anderson, Dr. Ryan Anderson, researches and writes about marriage and religious liberty. He is the William E. Simon Senior Research Fellow in American Principles and Public Policy at the Heritage Foundation. He is also the founder and editor of Public Discourse, and that's the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. Now, Ryan's recent work at Heritage focuses on the constitutional questions that surround same-sex marriage. He is most recently the author of a book titled Truth Overruled: The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. That's a book that's out from Regnery. That's the first book-length response to the Supreme Court's recent ruling on marriage. And he's also the co-author of a book titled What is Marriage? Man and Woman, a Defense. That's from Encounter Books. And finally, I think it's important to add that Ryan was cited by Justice Clarence Thomas in Thomas's dissenting opinion in the recent Supreme Court case involving state marriage laws, in addition to which Justice Samuel Alito cited Ryan twice in his dissenting opinion back in the 2013 Supreme Court case involving the Defense of Marriage Act. So I think we've got someone with great credentials to get us started, and please join me in welcoming Ryan Anderson.
I should start by saying it's a privilege to be cited by the Supreme Court, but you would always prefer to be cited in the majority opinion than cited in two different dissenting opinions in two different cases. I know how to lose really well. So what I want to talk a little bit, the panel is titled The Future of Marriage, but I want to start by saying a little bit about the history of marriage. So I think we can't really think that much about the future without understanding where we've come from. It was 50 years ago that Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote his famous report on the state of the black family in the United States. And Moynihan was ringing the alarm bell that births to single mothers was approaching 25% in that community, while in the population as a whole, they were in single digits. And he was saying this will cause a disaster. It'll be severe consequences for this community. We need to understand what has caused this problem and how we can address it. Moynihan was roundly criticized for being a racist as a result of this. I mean, he's a liberal senator from New York State. He was a Harvard professor. He wrote this report precisely because he wasn't a racist, but because he cared about poor people. Fast forward 50 years later to today, and we know that 40% of all Americans are now born to single mothers, 50% in the Hispanic community, and over 70% in the African American community. This has attracted the attention both left and right. Robert Putnam's written a recent book about this. He's a liberal sociologist at Harvard, and then Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, is probably the best known book on this question. And what Murray did in particular was that he separated the question of race. He focused on the white family, and what he showed was that this same division, we're coming apart not along lines of religion or lines of politics, lines of race or ethnicity, but marital lines. The big division, the two Americas in Edwards's terminology, between the haves and the have-nots, are those children who have a mom and a dad and those children who have not a mom and a dad. And Washington, D.C. just contrasts Georgetown with Anacostia. It's not that Georgetown has better progressive tax rates or better curbside recycling or better whatever progressive government program you might want. It's that Georgetown has stronger families, and the majority of the kids in Georgetown are being raised by their mom and dad, and the minority of the children in Anacostia have that great gift. And when this doesn't happen, that's where we see social costs. So when we see increased welfare spending, increased police activity, increased prison populations, more or less everything you could care about if you care about limited government and social justice is better served by strong, healthy families. So the first thing to say about this historical point is that gays and lesbians aren't to blame for the breakdown of the American family. Heterosexuals are. It was straight people who bought into a bad understanding of human sexuality and of the family that came out of the 60s, that came out of the sexual revolution, that caused this problem. Now I'm oversimplifying. There are a host of economic causes, technological causes, and then philosophical causes. I mean, look at economic changes, women entering the workforce, look at technological changes with the advent of the contraceptive pill, but also look at new ideas about the family. So we don't want to be Marxists and think it's just about technology and economics. We don't want to be Hegelians and think it's just about the ideas. We want to be Aristotelians and see that it's both about the form and the matter, and Aristotle's way of thinking about this. And so one of those aspects is that there were bad ideas coming out of the sexual revolution. Love makes a family. Marriage should last as long as the love lasts. More or less the idea here was that consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do. And the outcome of that was a generation or two with the rise of the hookup culture, with the rise of non-marital childbearing, with the rise of the rates of divorce, and then the introduction of no-fault divorce laws. And no-fault divorce laws actually help explain that doubling in divorce rates to a certain extent. The problem with the recent Supreme Court decision is that it doesn't help us address any of these problems. It only makes them worse. Because what just took place is that Justice Anthony Kennedy took the philosophy of marriage that comes out of the sexual revolution, that marriage is about consenting adult romance and caregiving, and he's now enshrined it into the 14th Amendment of our Constitution, with no legitimate legal warrant whatsoever for this. I was speaking yesterday at Harvard Law School to an audience of largely liberal, progressive students, and they were agreeing Kennedy's opinion is terrible. They said, well, but we like the outcome. It could have been justified on other grounds, and they were exploring other legal possibilities. But they all seemed, no one there seemed to be willing to defend the actual opinion that Anthony Kennedy and the four liberal justices signed on to. It's the best example of kind of Lochnerism or judicial activism that we've seen in my generation. I think since Roe v. Wade, this is the clearest example of unelected judges simply inserting their personal preferences about a policy issue on which the Constitution is silent, but then declaring that the Constitution impelled their ruling. And so it's appropriate on a Constitution Day program to mention the Constitution's relevance on this issue. The Constitution leaves this sort of a debate, the definition of marriage, the public policy purposes of marriage, to the people. Neither the founders of our nation nor the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment had any idea that the 14th Amendment would require 100 or so years later a redefinition of marriage to eliminate the expectation of sexual complementarity. The founders of our union and the ratifiers of the 14th Amendment would have all thought that marriage by its very nature was a union of sexually complementary spouses, was a union of a man and woman, a husband and a wife, a mother and a father, and they would have been shocked to see unelected judges somehow discovering in the penumbras from emanations a fundamental due process right to redefine what marriage is. Hillary Clinton only discovered this a week or so before the Supreme Court ruled. But she's not a lawyer, so you need advanced legal, or she is a lawyer, both of them. I thought it was only Bill, but, so here's the problem. I mean, we could talk about judicial activism, but I think that's only gonna get us so far. I think the larger problem, and what I try to do in this most recent book that I've written, is say that it's only because of the cultural redefinition of marriage, the hookup culture, no-fault divorce, the rise of non-marital childbearing, the rise of cohabitation, all of the things that heterosexuals did to the institution of marriage that put us at a place in which the legal redefinition of marriage was even a possibility. The legal redefinition of marriage is only possible after 40 years of the cultural breakdown. You could only think the male-female part of marriage isn't all that important when you already have 40% of your children being born outside of marriage, when you already have 40-some% of your marriages ending in divorce, when you already have many of your couples engaging in non-marital sexual relations. So I think it's good that this panel settled the future of marriage, not just the future of the same-sex marriage debate or something like that. Because the question is now, what can we do to strengthen marriage in a culture in which it's been legally redefined, and legally redefined at the highest level of our law? Because what we saw in Kentucky the past 2 weeks is what happens when judges do this rather than the people or legislatures. Kentucky had voted on marriage. It was 70-some% of their citizens voted to define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. 5 unelected judges threw that vote out. And when they did so, they didn't create any sort of accommodations for religious conscience. States that had democratically redefined marriage were able to, at the same exact time, include protections for religious liberty. But all four of the dissenting justices point out in their dissenting opinions that the court couldn't do that because that question wasn't before them. Only the marriage definition question was before them. So had we been able to work this out democratically, we could have come to better outcomes to protect an actual constitutional right, the free exercise of religion, had this not been a matter of judicial usurpation. So what else can we do now? What I suggest throughout this book is that we should learn the lessons from the pro-life movement. And what I mean by that is that after Roe v. Wade, 42 and a half years ago, there were people who were sitting in a room like this saying, what do we do? The court has just discovered a right to abortion from penumbras and emanations. Somewhere in the 14th Amendment, there's a right to privacy, and somehow that right to privacy includes a right to kill an unborn child. And all of the state laws that were protecting unborn children were declared null and void. Let me give you 3 lessons that I think should shape the future of how we engage on this particular question. The first is that they rejected Roe v. Wade. You can't find a single conservative that thinks Roe v. Wade is good constitutional law. It tells a lie about our Constitution. It told a lie about unborn human beings. And every year on January 22nd, in the bitter cold, some of the worst weather that you can have in D.C., 500,000 people come to Washington to March for Life precisely to protest that unjust, illegitimate Supreme Court ruling. I think something very similar needs to happen. The Constitution's not just for lawyers and judges. The Constitution's for all citizens. And so it'll be important for we, the people, to say that this Obergefell ruling got the Constitution wrong, it gets the nature of marriage wrong, and it's not the last word. That this is not the last word about marriage, and that we're going to do whatever we can to restore a sound understanding of marriage into our law and into our policy. Second lesson, what did the pro-life movement do after Roe v. Wade? They protected their freedom, they protected their rights not to be complicit in abortion. I wasn't around in the mid to late 70s, so I actually had to look into the history of this, but the activists and the ideologues on the left said abortion is a constitutional right, abortion is health care like any other health care, every doctor, every nurse, every hospital, every pharmacist, every insurance plan should be forced by the government to perform abortion and pay for abortion. The activists and the ideologues lost that debate. The reasonable liberals and pro-lifers worked together to say, even if you're in favor of abortion, there's no reason why you should advocate for the government to force a pro-life doctor to perform an abortion, an evangelical nurse to assist in an abortion, a Catholic pharmacist to dispense the morning after pill, a Catholic hospital to have to be performing abortions. It's vitally important that we now do the same thing on this marriage issue. That we appeal to reasonable liberals, people who are in favor of same-sex marriage, to say there's no reason why you should be revoking the accreditation of Hillsdale College because it doesn't believe in same-sex marriage. There's no reason why you should be denying federal student loans to students at Wheaton College because they don't accept same-sex marriage. There's no reason why you should be shutting down Catholic charity adoption agencies because they want to find orphans homes with married moms and dads. There's no reason why the baker or the florist or the photographer should be fined thousands of dollars simply because they believe marriage is the union of a man and a woman. That part of pluralism, part of diversity, part of tolerance, use every liberal PC buzzword in the book, is about coexistence, another liberal PC buzzword. But we can hold them to their own principles, and I think we can actually appeal to the more reasonable liberals that their activists and their ideologues are going way too far. One of the best-known cases involves a 70-year-old grandmother. She's had gay employees. She was selling flowers to a particular gay couple for a decade. It was only when they asked for same-sex wedding flowers that she had to sit down with them and say, I can't do this, I'm an evangelical, this would violate my beliefs about the nature of marriage, and I can't use my God-given talents to celebrate a lie about God's institutions of marriage. In a pluralistic, tolerant society, we can let this florist live by her conscience. And in fact, it's what the First Amendment requires of us. And so I think we're going to have to work on that second prong. The last prong, and I think this is where the other two speakers will focus the most, and so I will probably say the least right now about it, is that we have to do what the pro-life movement did and bear witness to the truth over the long haul. This issue will not be won with the next vote in Congress. It will not be won with the next election, the 2016 election cycle. This will be something that your children and your children's children will still be working out. And so just like the pro-lifers have now for 42 years committed themselves to building a culture of life, we have to commit ourselves to building a culture of marriage. This is what the original marriage movement was about. In the 80s and the 90s, when scholars and activists got together to launch something called the marriage movement, it wasn't about same-sex anything. In the 80s and 90s, same-sex marriage wasn't even plausible to most scholars and activists. The work of people like Maggie Gallagher and David Blankenhorn and the U.S. Catholic bishops and many others was about strengthening intact married families with moms and dads so that kids will be raised by their mom and dad. We need to do that, and we need to find creative ways of doing that, even in a legal culture in which the truth has been overruled. And I think the starting point for that is going to be for us to live it out in our own families. So I'll just close with this idea. Pope Benedict, a world-class intellectual, a world-class theologian and philosopher, debated Habermas, probably the leading European intellectual of their age. He's like the John Rawls of Europe. He's famous for saying it's not the arguments of the philosophers and the theologians that convert people, it's the lives of the saints. And so what I would close with is a suggestion here is that had we been living out the truth about marriage, a permanent, exclusive, monogamous union of man and woman, husband and wife, mother and father for the past 50 years, Anthony Kennedy would have never redefined marriage. And so if we want to build a healthy marriage culture, we'll need to start in each and every one of our own homes. Hillsdale College students, other college students, what's going on your campuses right now, is it preparing you to live fidelity in a lifelong committed bond to your husband or wife, or is it the hookup culture? We know that Hillsdale is much better on that particular question than most other college campuses. What's going on at the high school level? What's going on in our own communities? And so with that, I'm out of time, and thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. We're next going to hear from David French. David French is an attorney, writer, and veteran of the Iraq War. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School and a former lecturer at Cornell Law School. David is also a contributor to National Review and the co-author, most recently, of a #1 New York Times bestseller, The Rise of ISIS, A Threat We Can't Ignore. A winner of the American Conservative Union's Ronald Reagan Award, David is also a major in the United States Army Reserve, and he deployed to Iraq in 2007 with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, where he was awarded the Bronze Star. Please join me in welcoming David French.
So this panel isn't about ISIS. All right, new notes. I'm going to begin with a proposition that should be, at this point, about as well established as any proposition is in social science. And that proposition is that an intact mother-father family is the most conducive social arrangement for human flourishing of all of the social arrangements the mind of man has conceived yet in this nation or in the history of nations before this nation. And that the social science is bearing this out so abundantly, so repetitively, that if left to our own devices, and if there was such a thing as an actual cultural competition, those who advocate for the two-parent family, mother-father family, raising children in intact, lifelong marriage relationships, would triumph in what would be a cultural, political, legal, legislative landslide. But all other things are not equal. And the competition between a secular culture that has embraced consent as the single guiding moral touchstone, consent in the pursuit of sexual sensation, as the single two guiding moral touchstones of the sexual revolution, cannot abide the existence of a cultural alternative. Now, we saw this really beginning to emerge on college campuses, even going back 15 years. I will remember one of my first religious liberty cases on a college campus involved InterVarsity Christian Fellowship at Tufts University. Now, those of you who are familiar with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship know that it is hardly a hotbed of radical conservatism. InterVarsity is a hotbed, if anything, of progressive evangelicalism. It's a hotbed of truly interesting and creative ways of achieving racial and ethnic diversity in campus ministries. It is anything but a culture war institution. But in the March of 2000, it was thrown off campus by the Tufts Student Union judiciary on the grounds that, follow with me here for just a moment, Christianity teaches sin, that there is such a thing as sin. Are you with me on that? Okay. Sin, because this logic, by the way, is airtight. I don't know how we can rebut it. Sin causes someone, a feeling of that they're sinful causes someone to feel shame. You're with me? Shame leads to, who's going to be the first one to say it? Suicide, yes. So to save the lives of Tufts University students, InterVarsity had to be thrown off campus at a midnight meeting of a student judiciary without notice or an opportunity to be heard in their own defense. That was 15 years ago. 15 years ago. I remember speaking to Christian audiences years after that and saying, look, I want to explain to you the cultural challenge that awaits you. If you're going to be articulating a view of sexual morality, and let's pull it further back from just narrowly the marriage issue, a view of sexual morality that is against the sexual revolution in all of its forms, is consent-based morality, the pursuit of sensation is a good in and of itself, but instead you're going to talk about things like the preservation of life, saving sexual activity for marriage, lifelong covenant relationships between men and women to raise children. If you're going to be speaking along those terms, you will already are in certain parts of the United States labeled the moral equivalent of a white supremacist. And if you're not now, you will be. And I was treated with an unbelievable amount of skepticism. And I'm sorry to say that I've been proven largely correct in that prediction, that right now, not the center left, but the more radical left is trying to drive that message of human sexuality out of the public square so thoroughly that it is treated with the same level of dignity and respect that white supremacy is treated with today. And so, what do we do? What do we do? We have, I believe, 4 challenges: legal, legislative/political, religious, or cultural and religious. Let me begin with the legal challenge, and let me just preface by saying, abandon all hope, ye who enter the federal courts. The legal doctrine governing the sexual revolution right now is very simple, and it can be summed up in a hashtag: love wins. Okay, so whatever the balancing test is, hashtag love wins. Whatever the reason and logic applied, hashtag love wins. I mean, let's look at Justice Kennedy's opinion in Obergefell. Actually, let's not. It's too difficult to look at. Let's go from there. The Colorado Court of Appeals recently handed down a decision in which it determined that on the one hand, it was improper for someone to deny baking a cake for a same-sex wedding, but it was entirely proper to deny baking a cake that contained messages, religious messages, counter to homosexual sexual activity. So one was discrimination, the other one was free speech. That's the reasoning, because one was offensive and the other one was not. Well, let's go and look at Kentucky. Captain Nepotism himself, Judge David Bunning, and I say that as a Kentucky, I practiced in Kentucky for a long time, and he's the son of a senator, and it's an illustration as to why Republicans often can't be trusted with judicial nominations. He was known to be a thoroughly mediocre lawyer who was elevated to become a federal district court judge because he was the son of a senator. I remember distinctly that round of judicial appointments. 3 of the appointments that were made, 1 was on merit, 2 based on relationships to senators. This is what you get. You have a judge insecure in his own authority, faced with a menu of options to deal with a conscientious objector to marriage, and immediately races to the most draconian, throwing someone in jail. When there were fines as an option, there was impeachment as an option, there were state processes, as state judicial process as an option, off to jail, hashtag love wins. So let's not look to the courts here as a solution to our problems. What about the legislators? There's an awful lot of people talking about different forms of legislation that can protect religious conscience. Are they worth pursuing? Yes. Should we put our hopes in them? No. Why? Well, for one thing, every single piece of legislation that is passed is going to be judged by federal courts. They're going to evaluate that legislation under what doctrine? Hashtag love wins. So how many of those pieces of legislation are going to survive the process of judicial review? And not so many, perhaps. Some will. They're worth pursuing, and worth pursuing, if nothing else, for a symbolic rejection of judicial supremacy. We need to have governors and legislatures around the country, essentially, at least symbolically, majestically raising the middle finger to judicial supremacy, at least until they're forced to gently take the finger back down again. But it's worth it as a symbolic move, if nothing else, as an expression of dissent. And yes, some of these pieces of legislation will survive the process of judicial challenge and will protect religious free exercise. I think, for example, one of the areas that's most likely, that could be most fruitful for legislation is legislating protections for accreditation and tax exemptions for religious institutions, for religious colleges. I think that should be a priority, to protect as much as possible the autonomy of specifically religious institutions. What about cultural challenges? Now, I'm going to be wildly, blindly, absurdly optimistic here in saying the cultural challenge is not insurmountable. Okay? Whoa there. Not insurmountable? Are you kidding? This culture? No, it's not insurmountable. Look, the left has done a tremendous job of winning over this broad middle to their idea of human sexuality. There's a couple of things that they have going for them. One is, well, they've got the woohoo, sex is fun message going on. That's kind of tough to counter. I've been on college campuses and I've had debates over these kinds of issues, and my opponent will get up there and essentially do the debating equivalent of raising a red Solo cup full of booze and going, "Party on!" which the whole, the crowd is, yes. Well, that doesn't really last as a sustainable lifestyle. And so the left is crowing an awful lot over the fact through things like sitcoms, Modern Family, before that, Will and Grace, they won over a whole bunch of people. Well, let me clue you in on something. Folks who've been won over on the basis of sitcoms aren't your base. They're a little squishy. Other things can perhaps win them back. Well, do we have any evidence of that? Well, after Obergefell, one of the interesting phenomena that we saw was all kinds of little rainbow-colored Facebook profile pictures. And so what happened with all those rainbow-colored profile pictures? By the millions, they flooded Facebook with scolding, hectoring, mocking, triumphalism, spiking the football in the end zone, absolutely showed themselves to be intolerant scolds. What happened? Some interesting polls right after Obergefell, this huge cultural victory for the left, and they lost support significantly. Why? Because the left tends to overreach. It tends to overreach and will often do so dramatically. What's happened on college campuses? I don't have a book to promote, but I do have an article that I just wrote that I'd love for you to read on National Review, talking about how InterVarsity Christian Fellowship was the most embattled campus ministry, or most embattled ministry in the United States for the past 15 years, excluded from campus after campus after campus, labeled as bigots and haters, and what happened? It grew by every measure. It grew in size, it grew in budget, it grew in reach, it thrived, it prospered. And that leads me to the last segment, the religious challenge. And this is where I believe we have an immense advantage, an immense advantage. The religious community's response, the Orthodox, small o Orthodox religious community's response to Obergefell was overwhelming denunciation and rejection. It was not capitulation. It was not soul-searching about, oh, what do we do about this, other than soul-searching about how can we protect ourselves from the legal challenges that we face. And in fact, those church bodies that have moved to embrace the sexual revolution, what are they doing? They're dying quickly. I believe the Episcopal Church, and with all due apologies to any Episcopalians in the audience, I'm just going to say convert now. Your church doesn't exist. By 2037, and I could go on. I mean, in Nashville, there was a evangelical megachurch. Time magazine declared it an evangelical megachurch called Grace Point. It's not too far from where I live. Carrie Underwood goes there. They forsook her philosophy of Jesus take the wheel. They seized the wheel themselves, and they decided to embrace same-sex marriage. What happened to that church? Well, it was the Episcopal decline on steroids. It went from almost 2,000 members to now less than 1,000 weekly attendance, about 500 regular attendance, lost its budget. The marriage of the pastor collapsed. I mean, you talk about the entire mainline experience compressed into 18 months with one evangelical megachurch. So what the bottom line here is that for right now, the religious base of the marriage community is stronger in many ways than it's ever been. It's interesting. You look at the Pew Foundation did this study on the what's happening in America and to religious faith, and I'll end with this. And essentially, what the top line was there is a huge increase of the nuns. So again, you had on social media all your secular friends spiking the football, dancing in the end zone. Look at us, we're winning, you're losing, ha, ha, ha. Minimal growth in evangelicals. But then some folks began to dig into that data a little bit more seriously. And one of them is an excellent writer and recent Catholic convert from atheism named Leah Libresco. She writes at Pathos and writes for 538. She dug into the data, and what did she find? She found that the trends are actually the following: that America is becoming both more secular and more religious. How is that possible? So if you have a spectrum of people between the alls, the people who are all in on Orthodox faith, and the nuns, the people who are, the secularists in our culture, and the sums, who's dying out? It's the sums, not the alls. And so we're becoming increasingly an all or none religious culture in the United States. And I seem to recall that might be like predicted in a certain book that talks about hot and cold and lukewarm gets spewed. And so we're beginning to have a culture of all or none. Now, this is consistent in many ways with the larger polarization of the American public. What does that mean for us? It means that this is sad that we're polarized, But it also means that we should take heart. We're not actually on the run as much as we think we are. And that, in fact, if you're an evangelical and you dig into that Pew study, you'll find that not only are evangelicals the best at hanging on to their own kids, as far as of all of the various faith groups, they're better than everyone else at attracting new converts. So there's a lot of reason to look forward to the future with a degree of optimism. There is a better message. We have a stronger base. The culture is more in play than we thought. And if we can combine those elements, Justice Kennedy becomes less and less and less relevant. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Our next and final speaker will be Kay Hymowitz. Kay is the William E. Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. So we have the Simon Fellow at Heritage and now the Simon Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. And she is also a contributing editor of City Journal. She writes extensively on childhood, family issues, poverty, and cultural change in America. She is the author of, most recently, of a book titled Manning Up, How the Rise of Women Has Turned Men into Boys, 2011. A couple of her other books, Marriage and Caste in America, Separate and Unequal Families in a Post-Marital Age, it's from 2006, and Liberation's Children, Parents and Kids in a Postmodern Age, among others. She has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, New York Newsday, Public Interest, the Wilson Quarterly, and Commentary. Please join me in welcoming Kay Hymowitz.
Thank you. I actually do want to thank the Hillsdale for inviting me today, or I did want to thank them until I realized I'd be following a Bronze Star. I think I should have been warned about that. Yesterday, when I was coming down to Washington, D.C., I went through Penn Station in New York City, lovely Penn Station, and I was stopped short when I went into the newsstand by a Time magazine cover, which I have here, and I don't expect you'll be able to read, well, maybe you can, actually, with the camera there. It says, "Is monogamy over?" With the bright red, I thought of it as a bright red lipstick colored cover. Now, I don't know why I was stopped short. I've been reading stories like these for decades now. The media loves stories like these and has for decades. And we've been treated to titles like The End of Marriage, Is This the End of Marriage? Is Marriage Outdated? Does the Ashley Madison hack spell the end of marriage? The Marriage Apocalypse, The Case Against Marriage. Here's another one, Is Marriage Finally Obsolete? Let's hope so. So, this is certainly nothing new. In 2010, Pew Research published a survey asking respondents, is marriage obsolete? And guess what? Almost 39% said yes. And if you just ask millennials, that is people in their 20s and possibly early 30s, the numbers were even higher, 44%. That report led to coverage in CBS, ABC, CNN, The Washington Post, the NPR, USA Today, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The BBC didn't ask, is a marriage obsolete? They asked, is marriage outdated? Same thing. I guess that's the Britishism. They don't use obsolete. And we hear this kind of talk everywhere all the time. And as Ryan said earlier, and I quite agree with him, this is something that heterosexuals have caused to happen from my, certainly from my point of view as well. Is monogamy over though? How could the answer be anything but yes? As President Arnn asked earlier this morning, Is anyone here not worried? Well, we're all worried, but I think we have to be careful not to go too fast down that road. I'm a conservative. As a conservative, I think of human institutions, and I include marriage as fragile, and I think of human beings as well, not angels. In fact, they can be fickle and vain. So I would be inclined to think that the expressions of gloom must be right, that perhaps we are reaching a point of no return. But I don't, or at least I'm not quite there yet. And I want to explain why. I mean, David says the problems concerning marriage are not insurmountable. At the moment, I agree, but I'll probably change my mind before I reach the end of my comments, and they're not that long. Now, let's start with some of the bad news. You've heard some of it already. You know some of it, but let me repeat it anyway, because these numbers are just so incredible. In 1960, 5% of American children were born to unmarried mothers. 5%. It was a non-problem. Today, 41%. As Ryan said, those numbers are particularly high among blacks. 72% of black children are born to single mothers. About 50% of Hispanics and around 24% of whites. That 24% number today is about where things were when for blacks when Moynihan wrote his famous or infamous report warning of an impending crisis. Now, you'll often hear skeptics respond very hopefully to these numbers by saying, well, many of those parents are actually cohabiting. Who says they have to be married to be decent parents? But we know in the United States, at any rate, seems to be somewhat different in Europe. We know that in the United States, those cohabiting relationships are extremely fragile. And though kids who are born to cohabiting parents are 3 times as likely to see those parents break up before their 3rd birthday, and many more before their 5th birthday. Fewer than half, that is 46% of children under 18 are in a home with their 2 married biological parents. That is in opposition to 73% in 1960. 34% of children are growing up with a single parent. That's versus 9% in 1960. So these are very alarming numbers. One of the biggest problems with these numbers, I believe, is that the collapse of marriage among certain groups, at any rate, has increased poverty and inequality and led to decreased chances of getting ahead of upward mobility. And this seems to me to be especially a problem today in a very competitive and globalized economy. Single parents, the children of single-parent families are 3 times as likely to be poor as married couple families. Worse, their children are more likely to remain poor. Even controlling for income and race, their children, particularly their boys, have more behavior problems, which reduces their chances of doing well in school, which, as I said, as I implied a moment ago, in a competitive globalized economy spells future problems. Here's the good news. You ready? We're ready for some good news, such as it is. So first, this decline in the number of children growing up with single parents or with being born to unmarried parents, that's the number I'm focusing on here, actually plateaued in the mid-90s and may have even declined just a smidgen. And it has remained somewhat stable for the last few years. So are we about to face something different, a new trend? Too soon to say, but at least it's not getting worse. The other piece of good news, which I'll modify, of course, because all good news is never as good as it seems in this business, the problem of family breakdown has actually come out of the closet. After a long period of denial, social scientists began to reach a consensus in the late 1990s that, in fact, the children of single mothers were doing worse than the children of married mothers on just about every measure they studied: school achievement, poverty, emotional well-being, drug use, delinquency, and graduation rates. It's true that not everyone is convinced, but in the academy, in the policy circles, people know what has happened, and they're finally willing to admit it. Here's Princeton University, just to give you one example. Here's Princeton University sociologist Sarah McClanahan, a liberal as far as I know, and someone who is highly respected in her field, but also one of the bravest voices in this area. She's been writing about it for a long time, and she's listened to. So here's what she wrote fairly recently. Children growing up with a single mother are doubly disadvantaged. They spend less time and receive less money from their biological fathers, and their mothers are also likelier to earn less than than married mothers are. Children born to unmarried parents fare worse on a wide variety of measures, some of which I just read to you. So that's the good news, minor as it is. But with public awareness about the diminished prospects of the children of single parents, as well as the relationship between unwed childbearing and poverty and inequality, with that awareness growing, more widespread and more informed, perhaps we are at a kind of tipping point. But the conversation remains deeply uncomfortable, even though policymakers, academics do know what's at stake here. They are extremely uncomfortable with the conversation. And I don't think that that's going to change.
Take their seats. We are going to extend here just a little bit so we can get the panel finished off. I told Matt Spalding as we were evacuating that he should not invite me to any more of these, because one of the last times that Doug Jeffrey, our vice president, and I were in D.C., they had to evacuate the Marriott Wardman Park. Those of you who are from town know that hotel. You know how big it is. This was for the political science meeting. There were thousands of political scientists in various states of undress sprawled out all over the lawn. I don't mean to upset your lunch by saying that, but I have a bad record with evacuations and the District of Columbia, so perhaps it's best I don't come again. But what we're going to do is I'm going to ask Kay Hymowitz to take about 5 minutes to finish up her remarks, and then we will have a brief question and answer period to follow that, and then go directly to lunch. So without further delay, Kay, please come back to the podium.
So I believe that I was giving you my recipe for guacamole when we were in the the only good thing about that break was that I was able to change my mind 3 times in the course of. So at any rate, I've gone back and forth, good news, bad news. It's mostly bad news, as you probably remember. But there is this growing recognition among academics and policymakers, which I think is worth noting and making use of if possible. However, as non-marital childbearing becomes more of a norm all over the Western world, the younger generation is going to find it difficult to speak truthfully about its effects. I was just speaking with somebody on the way in from our interruption, who was saying that his childhood best friend and cousin were both children who grew up with single mothers. And it's a very difficult topic. I've spoken to a number of Black audiences, and will tell you that I didn't think that it was an easy discussion to have, and I'm not sure how far I got. So this discussion is avoided as much as possible, despite the data. And if you want to see a very interesting example that I'll be writing about actually as soon as I can, you might read Ta-Nehisi Coates' new article in The Atlantic. It just was posted last night, called "The Black Family in the Age of Mass Incarceration." It has been already lauded as a masterpiece. It's brilliant, but he has not a word about the impact of father absence on children, unless those fathers are in jail. So I think that's a very telling observation. And this takes me to the final concern that I think we should have about breakdown, family breakdown. And this concern, I think, really will divide us on political lines and makes this the future more uncertain. Even while admitting the serious disadvantages for children, the academic and policy community are offering the ambivalent public a way out of the dilemma. And what is that offering? What is it they're offering? Bigger government. They propose enlarging the already considerable infrastructure of government support for single mothers. In 1996, the U.S. passed welfare reform instituting work requirements and time limits. So welfare got stricter, but in the meantime, we have a steady supply of programs that help to sustain the fragile single-parent household. In New York City, those include not just my home of New York, where I'm most familiar with the scene. In New York City, includes not just federal programs like food stamps, the Women's and Infants Care, WIC, the WIC program, child care credits, Head Start, Medicare, SSI, but also public housing, disproportionately occupied by single parents, single-parent households, special education programs, also disproportionately used by by the children of single parents, and extremely expensive and bureaucratically demanding. After-school program, preschools, and maybe, for all I know, midnight basketball. Excuse me. We could try baseball, but I think it's midnight basketball. And it's by no means clear, no matter what our philosophy of government is, how to entirely dismantle this infrastructure, even if it were politically possible or morally wise. As a political matter, the entrenched system of benefits, labeling those who warn, has the effect of labeling those who warn about unintended consequences as greedy and lacking in compassion. And this is a political challenge that I have yet to see anybody address very well. Return finally to the question, is monogamy over? Sometimes we conservatives say that Americans, or emphasize how much Americans are lacking in values. I would put it a little bit differently. I think that the values have shifted, and they have shifted to the detriment of marriage. Premarital sex, cohabitation, divorce, non-marital births, homosexuality, clearly all have become far more acceptable to Americans than they were just a decade ago. But there's something interesting that has also shown up in surveys, which I think captures just an ambiguity and ambivalence that's out there. The Pew survey, no, I believe this was a Gallup survey, they did a study asking whether having an affair, being unfaithful to a spouse, was a bad thing. And you know what? People think that's worse than just about anything that they can do. It is the one area where there is consensus. 91% of Americans believe cheating on a spouse is morally wrong. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? That's 2 times, by the way, what the number was 40 years ago. It's food for thought. But it does suggest that the human predilections towards jealousy, the longing for permanence, and for deep abiding bonds is still very much with us. It's a small piece of comfort for us here, maybe, but one to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay. In spite of the fire alarm, I think it's the case that this panel has been much more agreeable than the first panel this morning. And so because of that, I'm actually going to see if I can play a little bit of a devil's advocate here and ask the first question of the panelists. Now that gay marriage is the law of the land, as it were, I know a couple of the panelists have suggested trying as best we can to carve out protections and exemptions for conscience or for religion, and certainly as a practical matter, it's hard to think about doing otherwise. But I did want to ask, is there a need to be careful with that, especially since if we consider today we're celebrating Constitution Day, we're kind of bemoaning the lack of understanding of the principles of the founding. And I think you can make a good case that it would have been very concerning to the founders to hear the argument that there should be exemptions or carve-outs for certain groups from otherwise generally applicable laws. And in that, I think they would have thought that about religion. They would have thought that even religious belief doesn't get exemption from laws that are otherwise constitutional or good. And so I guess I would ask the panelists, are we just essentially settling now, and maybe this is what we have to do, but settling now for a second best, and do we have to be careful about shrouding our, claiming too strongly the mantle of the Constitution as we seek special exemptions for religion or conscience?
So I have a couple. Is this on? Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts about that. I'm not sure that I agree with your characterization of the founders. I mean, there's a debate between Michael McConnell and Jerry Bradley on whether or not the First Amendment, as originally understood, would include exemptions from otherwise generally applicable laws. Scalia sided with Jerry Bradley and Robbie George in that debate, but I think Michael McConnell has a good counterargument, especially from historical practice. It does seem like we accommodated a variety of religious beliefs that did conflict with generally applicable laws, especially when it comes to pacifists and people who couldn't take oaths and things like that. And so I wouldn't want to be too quick to say that the founders weren't in favor of some accommodations and exemptions. But I take your general point exactly right. The best way to protect your freedoms are not to pass bad laws in the first place and not to have unelected judges legislate bad laws from the bench in the first place. So you're entirely right that we are in a second best world after the court Roe v. Wade decision and after the court's Obergefell decision. So the long-term goal for the pro-life movement is to overturn Roe and to reinstate laws that protect unborn children. In the meantime, they need to protect their freedom to do that. And so it was vitally important that we didn't allow the activists on the left to win and to force pro-life doctors and nurses to perform abortion and to make it impossible to be a Catholic hospital. The left would love nothing more than if all of our social services were delivered by the state. And they can win on both their sexual agenda and their big government agenda if Catholic schools are shut down, lose their accreditation, lose their nonprofit tax status, if Catholic hospitals are shut down. This is part of what's going on with the HHS mandate. Is it going to be possible for these non-governmental institutions of civil society to exist with their own character? And the left, if they shut down Catholic charity adoption agencies, they say it's a 2-for-1 victory. Now the government's going to be doing all of these adoptions, and the Catholics lose on their moral values. So I would say, like, ultimately, yes, the long-term goal here is to overturn Obergefell and to reinstate the sound understanding of marriage into our law and policy. One of the short-term techniques will be protecting our freedom to live accordance to the truth in our own institutions, our churches, our schools, our charities, and our businesses.
One thing I would say, going to the founder's point, I think what we're dealing with the Kennedy decision in Obergefell, Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and before that Roe, is we have a state establishment of religion from the judicial branch of the United States. And that in the face of that state, what is for all practical purposes just a purely moral judgment located in the worldview of various justices over the years, that makes the free exercise argument that much more indispensable. That free exercise in the face of potential establishment was critical to the founders' vision of what would maintain a religiously diverse and pluralistic country and keep us together. So the notion of defending free exercise is critically important, particularly in the face of this state establishment. And I don't think that we should view the Obergefell decision through a legal lens at all. Just like I don't think we should view Planned Parenthood v. Casey through a legal lens at all. These are the sweet mystery of life decisions. That, the most important thing is that a person be able to chart for themselves their own course and their own definition of yada, yada, yada. And that's not law, that's religion. And so then the second thing that a strong free exercise argument and a religious accommodation argument does is it continues to highlight same-sex marriage, abortion, other elements of the sexual revolution as something outside of what is proper and what is right. And that is what irritates the left so much about a Kim Davis. Because that's somebody who's standing there saying day after day, same-sex marriage is wrong, same-sex marriage is wrong, same-sex marriage is wrong, it's not the same, it's not the same, it's not the same. Well, somebody shut her up. Throw her in jail. We don't want to hear this anymore. And so what these religious accommodations do is they provide room for that argument. And in fact, indeed, even the disputes over the accommodation themselves, so long as we maintain fidelity to our message and a modicum of courage, I think ultimately work to our favor. But to do that and to be able to maintain those arguments, we have to become what I would call informed, apathetic militants. We need to be informed on the issues, utterly apathetic to the shame storm on Twitter, utterly apathetic to what's happening to you on Facebook. Ryan is very well practiced at this point. But we have to be militant in defending our constitutional liberties. And so informed, apathetic militants. And one of the great things is, and as I see a lot of Hillsdale students here, is I'm seeing the rise of these anti-millennial millennials within the conservative movement who've got this down pat. They know a Twitter storm isn't all that important. They know they can withstand it, and they know what's right and are pursuing what's right.
I don't disagree with anything really, but I want to add one other idea, which is that in the future we should be also focused on what we can do to make marriage more possible for particularly low-income and particularly low-income blacks. And the question of how to do that, I don't, I've been studying for years. I don't exactly know what it is, but I think it's a mistake to only focus on Obergefell and not to remember that there are many, many people suffering now under the regime that that heterosexuals began 4 or 5 decades ago, and that we should be thinking about them as well.
So I think, given the circumstances, we're going to have an abbreviated, I can't see how many fingers are holding up, Matt. One. We are going to have one question. We have 2 microphone holders, but only one question will be allowed. So who is going to ask it? This gentleman right here.
Where do you draw the line in religious acceptance between the peyote wanting Indians who got turned down the Sharia law adherent who beheaded his daughter because she wasn't wearing a veil, and the photographer or the cake baker who don't want to help celebrate a institution they disagree with. I have a hard time thinking we're going to be able to find that bright line between religion A, prospects, say Christianity, and religion B, Sharia law. Could you help me?
So it's a great question.
Let me just back up for a minute and say historically, America has navigated that relatively easily. Before what I believe was a bad decision in Employment Division v. Smith, where the Supreme Court did away with the compelling interest balancing test and essentially said any generally applicable law is going to prevail over a religious liberty claim, we had actually done a pretty good job of navigating the difference between providing people with a wide range of options for free exercise and then narrowing that range when that free exercise concretely impacted the recognizable legal rights of others. So my view on a peyote smoking Native American is it's no threat to the Republic. It's not any real threat to anyone else if they smoke peyote. Fine. In the instance of Sharia law, there's a lot of elements of Sharia law, and many of them concretely infringe upon the legally protected rights of other citizens, including the right to life, including rights to fundamental liberties, and that's a different situation. But a lot of the parade of horribles that you hear about if Hobby Lobby wins, if we go back to the RFRA compelling interest test, what's going to happen to our country? Well, we know. We've already been through that for the majority of real free exercise jurisprudence in this country was under a compelling interest standard. The civil rights movement still occurred. The Republic did not fall apart. We were able to, in fact, those years were some of the more unified years in American history. And so I'm just not convinced that there is a parade of horribles if you give religious free exercise a wide berth. I think the real genuine anger towards religious free exercise is on the left is not from a fear that something will crumble with our republic, but it's out of a demand for intellectual conformity, that the existence of that dissent itself is intolerable and has to be addressed.
Let me add just one thing to that. The way that the left thinks about this is that it's a presumption of uniformity, and you, the objector, has to justify why you should have freedom. The way we should think about this is it's a presumption of liberty, and the government has to justify why it's burdening your liberty. And so as David mentioned, the way that this has historically been done is that the government can only infringe upon the free exercise of religion for a compelling state interest in the least restrictive way possible. And so in the case of some aspects of Sharia law, if you're beheading people, that's a compelling state interest, keeping heads attached to shoulders. The least restrictive way of accomplishing that is not letting anyone's head be severed from their shoulder. And so we can see how we would apply that. But there are many other aspects of Sharia law that we can allow. Muslims should be free to be Muslims. Jews should be free to be Jews. Catholics free to be Catholics, unless their exercising their religion somehow infringes on a compelling state interest that's being pursued in the least restrictive way possible. Otherwise, the presumption should be freedom.
Okay. Please join me in thanking our panelists.